Yeah, I'm also fascinated by the use of the word machine in the description of Anna's work, because I think it gets at a certain analogy between machines and history making in the way they both aim to record, simulate, or produce patterns. In other words, how they run on algorithms and repetitions in a way, but they're also constantly on the verge of like breaking down or like committing error. So yeah, so like, do you want to think on those terms a little bit for each of you, or for Genevieve and Anne? Would there be an analogy to machines that will work for your sculptures?
Yeah, I could start there. So when I started calling or referring to my work as moment machines or machines, is I guess I'd originally thought about them as clocks, which are particularly complicated machines, and I felt that my work was not so much. So I was thinking about like the very first tools, like technology being like wheels or wood, like a pulley, simple ball joints. And my work is very, very basic when it comes to like these types of engineering. When you were talking about error and breakdown, I my mind immediately went to motors, like the work that plugs into walls and how that was always like almost a promise it's going to break down or make a noise or screech. But when it came to, like, for instance, the hourglass piece, which was meant to break down and degrade, I started thinking about um, how, one, that was meant to happen, but how it's possible with anything that has any kind of movement, especially, or any kind of technology, especially like even if it is just like a standing sculpture, be it weather or time, you can consider this like error breakdown, especially if there's interaction. But I was very much thinking of those moment machines as a sort of mark maker as opposed to simply clocks at that point. Instead of minutes, like they can be like, I don't know, taking account of events, or like the broken bottles are like meant to be the passing of time, or it's just about duration. But these are all kind of like metaphors and metaphors, and that's why I started talking about my work kind of like that, in the sense of a machine. I was also thinking about production and like working class, and that's what my materials kind of harken to. Um, Kind of in a similar way, where like with Anne's use and her relationship with stainless steel. Yeah.
Um, I like that you ended on this note because I feel like the machine, when I think about machine kind of in my work, I think, immediately there's obviously the machines that I use to make it, but I feel like in a way those are only like sort of second tier references to the idea of trying to think of how to say this. I'm very interested in sort of abject pop culture, and sort of pop culture refuse. So a joke that I have to torture my friends and myself with is that I make steampunk art, which I don't, but like I like to say that to people because it makes them really uncomfortable. And there's this idea, like I've talked to Anne a lot about pop punk and Hot Topic, and I had people compare my art to Spencer's Gifts before, and like and I think that there's something that when I think of machine, I think of the machine almost like the aesthetics of the camp of machinery is something I am very interested in my art, because it's sort of the camp of the person who tinkers, of the person who makes, of the person who's like building these things that have some kind of function, but it's all a joke because it's art. So its function is just in your head or imaginary or whatever you want to say that it is. And I think this, like, it goes into like the sort of the character of the mad scientist or the inventor, but like it's always play acting in a way. And then except that it's not, because art does work. Like good art should work. It should do something for someone in some way because they wanted to look at it and then they did, and that's like the result coming out of the machine. And I think that, like, I was thinking about, Anna, what you said about like sort of the connection between machinery and like class. And there's this idea of effortlessness, laborlessness, and then there's like this idea of art that requires like labor and fabrication. And then there's this idea that art is a very classed activity. And I think one thing that I think about, where the machine has always been this kind of like controversial thing that represents both, like, has been some sort of idea of a great equalizer, but also something that in the end has just increased the, you know, the exploitation of the classes in some ways. And I think that there's this idea of the mechanics of how art work as, you know, if we understand it, if we look at it all as kind of having operating instinctively as a machine functioning in this way, it contributes to being able to see art as not necessarily like a completely classed object, because its function isn't only in its ability to be purchased, or its thing as just an object that we consume, but also as something that performs something alongside the viewer. So whether or not you can afford the object, you're still in the space of the object, or you see the object, and the machine happens between the person, and the machine function happens between the person viewing it and the object itself. And I think that to me is a very appealing idea of how to look at art. It also then ties back into this idea of, you know, kind of the art pretending, like, if you dress a piece of art up as a machine, maybe people will understand it as one almost, you know. It's one reason I like to look at the model trains in my art, or putting model trains in my art and stuff like that, because I think that there's like, even if it's pretend, maybe people could make the jump to seeing that maybe it's not actually pretend. I don't know how much sense that even made.
I think it's so interesting to think about how each of us thought about this question, because when I think about machines, I'm thinking about how something that generates some sort of movement or encourages some sort of sense of travel through the body. And so when I think about it in terms of my work, I don't know if it's quite an analogy, but I often have this two minds going at once, where I'm making these larger structures and I'm making these very small objects that are cast or found. And I always think that there's something in terms of those small objects that work kind of like tools, or offers a mechanism for viewing or moving through the space, where these forms that are generally pretty cohesive, formally look as if they're part of one thing, have these little quirks that kind of guide your eye. And through that, perhaps in this current work, those moments of color also offer some kind of suggestion of movement through space, or how things are joined together. And so for me, the purpose of these kinds of moments of machinery in my work is to create this scale shift in which you, as a viewer, are brought closer to these objects that generally you feel at a larger scale relationship to. And also in terms of travel, these objects are, in my mind, or in the purpose of creating these, are what holds these markers of culture for me, or these like moments of historical or like personal significance. So for instance, a cast of an emblem, or you know, an incense bottle cap. Those are these are little points where I'm connecting these larger forms that can be more responsive to the site, and bringing in this connection to a cultural background. And it's interesting to hear Genevieve and Annabelle talk about class and relationship to something outside of the art sphere. And for me, those objects hold that space. And in that way, they're like little machines, or little like portals or moments to think about something outside of where the works are installed, which is, you know, a sterilized more or less white cube space.